$37 trillion. Let that sit for a second. Not million, not billion, trillion. But here's the thing. Most people hear that number, nod their head, and scroll right past it like it has nothing to do with them. But what if I told you that number is the single most dangerous financial force quietly reshaping your life right now, and almost nobody is talking about what it actually means for the money in your pocket? This is the U.S. national debt. And today we are going to break it down in a way that actually makes sense. Not the boring textbook version, not the political shouting match version, the real version. The version that connects the dots between a decision made in Washington and the reason your groceries cost more, your rent went up, and your paycheck feels smaller every single year. Because this is not just a government problem. This is your problem. And the sooner you understand it, the better position you will be in to protect yourself. So let us start from the very beginning. Every single year, the United States government collects money from its citizens. This is called taxes. You earn money, the government takes a cut. Your employer runs a business, the government takes a cut. You buy something at a store, the government takes a cut. This money, all of it collected from everyday working people and businesses across the country, is what the government is supposed to use to run the country. To build roads, to fund the military, to pay for public services, to keep the lights on, so to speak. But here is where things get interesting, and I mean that in the worst possible way. Every single year, without fail, regardless of which political party is in power, regardless of what promises were made on the campaign trail, the United States government spends more money than it collects. Every single year. This is called a deficit. And it is not a new problem. It is not something that started recently. It has been happening for decades across administrations of every kind, and the number keeps climbing. When the government spends more than it collects, it does not just stop spending. It borrows. And when you borrow money year after year after year without paying it back, the debt grows. That is exactly what has happened. $37 trillion of exactly that. Now you might be wondering, who does the United States actually borrow from? Because this is the part that most people do not think about. It is not some shadowy back-alley deal. It is actually a system that involves people and institutions you interact with every single day. The government issues what are called treasury bonds. Think of these as official IOUs. The government says, lend us your money now, and we will pay you back later with interest. And a huge number of Americans take that deal. Banks take that deal. Investment funds take that deal. Pension funds take that deal. Even retirement accounts belonging to everyday people hold U.S. Treasury bonds without those people even knowing it. So in a very real sense, the American government is partly borrowing from its own citizens to fund its own spending. But it does not stop there. A significant portion of that debt is owed to foreign countries. Nations like China, Japan, and countries across Europe have historically been among the largest holders of U.S. debt. They lend money to the United States because for a very long time, the U.S. was considered the safest, most reliable borrower in the world. Lending to the U.S. was seen as essentially risk-free. You lend them money, they pay you back with interest, and everyone goes home happy. China at one point held over $1 trillion in U.S. debt. Think about that. A foreign government holding over $1 trillion worth of American IOUs. That is not a small thing. That is a relationship with enormous consequences, and we are going to talk about what happens when that relationship starts to crack. But first, let us talk about the debt itself and why it keeps growing at such an alarming rate. Because borrowing money is not automatically a bad thing. Individuals borrow money to buy homes. Businesses borrow money to expand. Countries borrow money to build infrastructure, fund wars, respond to emergencies. There is nothing inherently wrong with debt. The problem comes when the borrowing never stops, when the balance never comes down, and when the cost of carrying that debt starts to overwhelm everything else. And that is exactly where the United States is right now. Here is the mechanism that makes this particularly dangerous. When you borrow money, you do not just pay back what you borrowed. You pay back what you borrowed plus interest. Interest is the cost of borrowing. And the more you owe, the more interest you pay. The United States is now spending hundreds of billions of dollars every single year just on interest payments. Not on paying down the actual debt. Not on building roads or funding schools or improving healthcare. just on the interest, just on the cost of having borrowed so much for so long. And because the debt keeps growing, the interest payments keep growing with it. It is a cycle that feeds itself. You borrow more to cover the gap, but borrowing more means more interest, which means a bigger gap, which means you need to borrow even more. It is a snowball rolling downhill, and it has been rolling for a very long time. This is the foundation of everything we are going to talk about today. The debt exists. It is massive. It is growing. And it is not going away on its own. In the next part of this video, we are going to get into the mechanics of how this debt actually moves through the economy and starts touching your life in ways you might not have noticed yet. Because the connection between a number in Washington and the price of your groceries is more direct than most people realize, and understanding that connection is where things start to get really eye-opening. So now you understand the basic picture. The government spends more than it collects, it borrows to fill the gap, and the debt grows year after year. But here is where most explanations stop, and here is where ours is just getting started. Because the real question is not just how big the debt is. The real question is how that debt moves through the system and lands in your lap without you ever signing a single document or agreeing to a single thing. Let us talk about the Federal Reserve. Because no conversation about U.S. debt is complete without understanding the role of the Fed. And the Fed is one of the most misunderstood institutions in the entire country. The Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States. It is not exactly a government agency, but it is not exactly a private institution either. It exists in this unique in-between space, and it has enormous power over the financial system. One of the things the Fed does is buy U.S. Treasury bonds, those IOUs we talked about earlier that the government issues when it borrows money. When the Fed buys those bonds, it essentially creates new money to do it. Not physical cash printed on a press, but digital money that enters the system and increases the overall money supply. Now, why does this matter to you? Because when more money enters an economy without a corresponding increase in goods and services, the value of each individual dollar goes down. This is inflation. And while inflation has many causes, the relationship between government debt, Federal Reserve money creation, and rising prices is one of the most direct and least discussed connections in personal finance. When the government borrows heavily and the Fed steps in to absorb that debt by creating new money, the purchasing power of your savings quietly erodes. The dollar in your wallet today buys less than the dollar in your wallet 5 years ago. And the dollar in your wallet 5 years from now will likely buy less than the one you have today. This is not an accident. It is a predictable consequence of the system operating exactly as it is designed. But the Fed is only part of the story. Let us zoom out and think about what happens when international lenders, the foreign governments and institutions that hold trillions in U.S. debt, start to get nervous. Because the entire system of U.S. borrowing is built on trust. Trust that the United States will always pay its debts. Trust that the dollar will remain valuable. Trust that lending to America is the safest bet in the global financial system. For most of modern history, that trust was unshakable. But trust is a fragile thing. And when you owe $37 trillion, when your interest payments are consuming an ever larger share of your budget, when your political system is increasingly unable to agree on basic fiscal decisions, that trust starts to develop cracks. What happens if foreign lenders decide they want higher interest rates to compensate for the increased risk of lending to a heavily indebted United States? The government has to pay more to borrow, which means more of the budget goes to interest, which means less money for everything else. Or what happens if a major foreign holder of U.S. debt, say, a country that holds hundreds of billions in treasury bonds, decides to sell a significant portion of those bonds? The flood of supply in the market drives down the price of bonds, which drives up interest rates, which makes borrowing more expensive across the entire economy. Not just for the government, for businesses, for homebuyers, for anyone who needs a loan of any kind. The ripple effects of a shift in international confidence in U.S. debt would touch every corner of the economy, and most Americans would feel it without understanding why. This brings us to something called the debt ceiling, which you have probably heard mentioned in the news, usually during some kind of political standoff that feels like theater but has very real consequences. The debt ceiling is a legal limit on how much the U.S. government is allowed to borrow. Congress sets this limit, and when the government approaches it, Congress has to vote to raise it or the government runs out of money to pay its bills. Now historically, Congress has always raised the debt ceiling, sometimes dramatically, sometimes after extended political drama, but always in the end. Because the alternative, defaulting on U.S. debt, failing to pay back what was borrowed, would be catastrophic. It would shatter the trust that the entire system is built on. It would send shockwaves through global financial markets. It would raise borrowing costs not just for the government but for every American who ever needs a mortgage, a car loan, a business loan, or a credit card. And yet the fact that we keep bumping up against the ceiling, that we keep having these standoffs, that the ceiling keeps getting raised higher and higher, this tells you something important. It tells you that the trajectory is not changing. The debt is not coming down. The spending is not being brought under control. The gap between what the government collects and what it spends is not closing. It is widening. And every time the ceiling gets raised, the problem gets a little bigger, the snowball gets a little heavier, and the eventual reckoning, whenever it comes, gets a little more severe. Now let us bring this back to your life. Because everything we have talked about so far might still feel abstract. 37 trillion is such a big number it becomes almost meaningless. Federal Reserve policy and international bond markets feel like things that happen in boardrooms far removed from your daily reality. So let us make this concrete. Let us talk about what high national debt actually does to the life of an ordinary person trying to build wealth and financial security. The first and most direct impact is through interest rates. When the government borrows heavily, it competes with everyone else in the economy for available capital. This competition for money tends to push interest rates higher. Higher interest rates mean it costs more to borrow money. It costs more to get a mortgage. It costs more to finance a car. It costs more for a small business to take out a loan to expand. Higher borrowing costs throughout the economy slow down investment, slow down growth, and make it harder for ordinary people to make the financial moves that build long-term wealth. Buying a home is more expensive. Starting a business is more expensive. Getting an education through loans is more expensive. All of it becomes harder. The second impact is through inflation, which we touched on earlier. When the government runs large deficits and the Fed accommodates that borrowing by expanding the money supply, inflation tends to follow. And inflation is one of the most insidious forces in personal finance because it works slowly and invisibly. You do not notice it day to day. But over months and years, it quietly destroys the purchasing power of your savings. The money you worked hard to save is worth less and less over time. Unless your income and your investments are growing faster than inflation, which requires active effort and smart financial decisions, you are effectively moving backwards financially even if the numbers in your account are going up. The third impact is through government services and public investment. When a growing share of the government's budget is consumed by interest payments on the debt, there is less money available for everything else. For infrastructure, for education, for research and development, for the kinds of public investments that create economic opportunities for ordinary people. This is the opportunity cost of debt. Every dollar spent on interest is a dollar not spent on something that could improve lives and create economic growth. And as the debt grows and interest payments grow with it, the squeeze gets tighter and tighter. We have covered a lot of ground. You now understand where the debt comes from, how it grows, what role the Federal Reserve plays, how international lenders factor in, and how the ripple effects of all this connect to your everyday financial life. But here is the question that actually matters at the end of all this. What do you do about it? Because you cannot vote the debt away overnight. You cannot single-handedly change fiscal policy. But you are not powerless either, and that is what this final part is all about. First, let us acknowledge something that most conversations about national debt completely skip over. The debt, in a very real sense, is a wealth transfer. Money borrowed today with interest has to be paid back by someone eventually. And the people who end up paying through higher taxes, through inflation eroding their purchasing power, through reduced public services, are disproportionately ordinary working people who had no say in the decisions that created the debt in the first place. The people who benefit most from government spending funded by debt are often not the same people who bear the cost of repaying it. Understanding this is not about politics. It is about recognizing the financial reality you are operating in and making decisions accordingly. So what does making decisions accordingly actually look like? It starts with understanding inflation as a permanent feature of the environment you are living in, not an occasional problem that goes away. If the trajectory of government debt and monetary policy continues, and there is no serious reason to believe it will not, inflation will remain a persistent force. Which means holding large amounts of cash over long periods of time is not a neutral decision. It is a decision to slowly lose purchasing power. Protecting yourself from inflation means putting your money to work in assets that tend to hold or increase their value over time. Real estate, equities, productive businesses, assets that generate returns that can outpace the erosion of purchasing power. This does not mean you need to become a sophisticated investor overnight. It means understanding the basic principle that in an inflationary environment, sitting on the sidelines with your money in a low-yield savings account is a choice with consequences. Every year you delay investing in assets that can grow, inflation is quietly working against you. The national debt and the monetary policy it drives is essentially a tax on inaction. The people who understand this and act accordingly, who put their money into assets that appreciate, who build income streams that grow, are able to stay ahead of the erosion. The people who do not understand it are slowly falling behind without realizing why. The second thing you can do is pay very close attention to interest rates, because they are one of the most direct transmissions of debt-driven economic pressure into your personal finances. We talked about how high government borrowing pushes up interest rates across the economy. This affects you whether you are thinking about buying a home, taking out a business loan, managing credit card debt, or investing in bonds. Understanding the relationship between government borrowing and interest rates helps you make better timing decisions around major financial moves. It helps you understand why mortgage rates are where they are. It helps you understand why certain investment environments are more favorable than others. Interest rates are not random. They are the price of money, and that price is heavily influenced by how much the government is borrowing. Third, and this is something that very few personal finance conversations connect to, the national debt. Think carefully about the taxes you are likely to face in the future. Because one of the ways governments historically reduce debt burden is by increasing taxes. If the debt continues to grow and eventually becomes politically impossible to ignore, tax increases become one of the primary tools available. This is not a prediction of specific policy. It is a recognition of historical pattern. Governments that borrow heavily eventually have to raise revenue, and the most politically viable way to do that is through taxes. What this means for you practically is that tax-advantaged accounts and tax-efficient investment strategies are not just nice to have. In an environment of growing government debt, they are a form of protection against a future where a larger share of your income and investment gains gets claimed by the government to service obligations that were created long before you had any say in the matter. Now let us zoom out one more time and talk about something bigger. The U.S. national debt is not just a financial story. It is a story about priorities. It is a story about what a society values and what it is willing to pay for. Every dollar of debt represents a decision to spend on something now and defer the cost to later. Some of those decisions were arguably worth it. Infrastructure built, crises responded to, economic catastrophes averted. Others are more questionable, spending that served narrow interests, tax cuts that disproportionately benefited the already wealthy, programs that were funded not because they were effective but because they were politically popular. The debt is the accumulated result of all of these decisions across decades. And here is the uncomfortable truth that cuts across every political perspective. There is no painless way out. If the debt is ever going to be brought under control, and there are legitimate debates about whether it ever will be, it will require some combination of higher taxes, reduced spending, or faster economic growth. All three of these paths involve trade-offs. Higher taxes mean less money in your pocket. Reduced spending means fewer public services or benefits you might rely on. Faster economic growth is the most appealing option but also the hardest to engineer and impossible to guarantee. Anyone who tells you there is an easy, painless solution to $37 trillion of debt is either not being honest with you or does not understand the scope of the problem. What you can control is how informed you are and how well you position yourself in response to the environment you are actually living in rather than the one you wish existed. Understanding the national debt, understanding how it affects interest rates, inflation, taxes, and public investment, understanding the role of institutions like the Federal Reserve, understanding the global dimension of U.S. borrowing, all of this makes you a more informed, more capable financial decision-maker. It is the difference between being someone things happen to and someone who sees what is coming and responds with intention. The $37 trillion question is not going away. It is going to be one of the defining economic and political challenges of the coming decades. The people who understand it, who see the mechanisms clearly, who recognize the ripple effects in their own lives, who make financial decisions with this reality in mind, those are the people who will be best positioned to build and protect wealth in the years ahead. And that is exactly why we talk about this stuff. Not to be alarming, not to be political, but because understanding the world you are actually living in is the first and most important step toward building a life that works on your terms within it. That is the story of the debt. And more importantly, that is the beginning of your story of navigating it.